first of all, thank you for joining us today. We plan to discuss the impacts that privacy laws are having on technology, as well as the pain points it's currently addressing and in some cases creating. And then to go ahead and look at where we think the next wave of privacy tech tools and resources are bound to head. We do know that this audience is particularly savvy to tech and privacy, but Laura is kindly going to ground us in sort of an overview of the current three main buckets and pieces of privacy tech that we're seeing out there, if that's all right.
Sure, yeah. So I come at this from a pretty practical perspective. I lead privacy governance at Visa. And here, this function is really overseeing privacy governance as well as operations and the traditional records and information management function. So it's very end-to-end data protection focused. So as a consumer of privacy tech, you look across the landscape, and I think there are three main buckets. And the first bucket is really pretty traditionally understood to help people with privacy programs manage those programs. So things like, obvious compliance tools for breach response, things that really arose out of clear legal obligations. So PIAs, let's see, how to do your ROPA, your Article 30s, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of tools to help you assess where you are, like understand your legal obligations, do gap assessments. And I also think, interestingly, there's a bucket of technology that's emerging that's helping programs indicate, benchmark where they are with public trust and transparency. So, and I think Aoife will talk about these later, but things to help assess transparency, accountability, and maybe even ethical AI, things like that. I think the more invested in section is enterprise solutions, and those are really more enterprise data governance, security, data mapping, things that really have a broader application besides just privacy compliance. And then a third bucket, which Shoshana, I think you'll particularly talk about, is our consumer-faced privacy solutions. So things that help individuals navigate, browsers, messaging, things of that nature. So those are the kind of the buckets. So yeah.
No, thank you. And I think that's perfect. And as we all know here, right, in many ways, it was technology that gave rise to, it was technology that gave rise to the initial privacy concerns. So albeit much simpler technology. And because of the reproducible nature of data and the fact that two people sharing data can both have a full set as opposed to, say, an apple, it seems only fitting that the technology would also rise to meet the complications of the occasion that it begat, right? So we're looking at that here, and we know that we have seen and we can count on keeping on our horizon, rather, the continuing innovation in privacy tech. And I'm just curious, Efe, we were gonna speak with both of you, but Aoife, I'm so sorry. Aoife, the EU Data Protection Directive didn't start the fire. What do you think about GDPR and the laws that have come up in its wake, and how has that sort of impacted and created new room for innovation in privacy tech?
Hi, everyone. Really lovely to be with you all. And I was just smiling, Shoshana, because I was thinking about the question that I've posed before, which is, can technology help solve some of the problems that technology has created? And some people would say that's not a good thing to do. But I think that's what we're here to talk about to a certain extent, is the rise of privacy tech. And I think there's no doubt that this is a really exciting, burgeoning sector of tech. It's still quite nascent in many parts. And Laura gave a great overview of the various ways in which you'd look at the categorization of it, from, program management, automating that, scaling that, to probably more looking at the enterprise level, at the data levels, and then the B2C aspect, where consumers want to have more control over their rights, and the emerging platforms and solutions that are aspiring to give more rights to consumers and control. But, privacy laws have been around a long time, and yet you might ask, well, how come there's really a growth now in privacy tech? Maybe in a way that there was a growth in security tech 10, 15 years ago. I think what we're seeing now, and one of the things that I suppose would explain the growth is the fact that the privacy landscape has become much more global in its reach, and also a lot more complex in terms of if you're a privacy pro trying to manage compliance across different jurisdictions globally. I was looking at, what happened in 2020 and what's happening in 2021 in terms of privacy laws. And it is really astonishing to see the pace of privacy laws that are either being upgraded or updated or emerging. And when I name the countries that are or have made changes to the law or brought in new laws or updating laws, these are the really big populous countries around the world. So I'll mention Brazil, I'll mention India, China, Canada, Russia. So enormously important countries that are looking at their laws. So, just a whistle-stop tour in Brazil, it was September 2020, so end of 2020, where we saw the Brazilian new law, the LGBT, come into force. In India, in fact, this week in India, it's likely that there's going to be a session in Parliament or one of the committees where over 80 of amendments to this new omnibus law in India are likely to be debated. And I believe there's cross-party support for this. So it is likely we will see a really comprehensive law come into play in India. In China, October 2020, the Chinese government released a long-awaited draft of a comprehensive privacy law, the Personal Information Protection Law. So really one to watch there in terms of what's happening. In Canada, you have both laws which are emerging at a regional level, so in Quebec, but also the Canadian government in November introduced a bill, and Anne mentioned it earlier on the main stage, and this is a plan to modernize the federal privacy sector privacy regime. And then in Russia, end of December 2020, also additional amendments passed. So if you were asleep at the wheel at the end of 2020 or coming into 2021, you might have missed all of these incredibly new comprehensive laws that are coming into play. So one only has to step back and say, okay, well, the privacy landscape is changing at pace. We have lots of new laws coming into play. So the question, therefore, is how can privacy pros manage to try and have compliance with all these laws, particularly if you're operating and working in a very large international organization that's working across all these different jurisdictions. And, you look then at the laws themselves and you might ask, well, is there anything in the laws that might incentivize us to invest in privacy tools? And once you read most of the laws, they're agnostic as regards technology. They don't mention it. GDPR in particular doesn't have anything about it. But as Laura was mentioning in the beginning, if you look at the categorization of laws, first of all, I call it moving from your Excel spreadsheet. So prior to the GDPR, you might have been able to manage an Excel spreadsheet, maybe for your data inventory, maybe for your data records, maybe you had a couple of data subject access requests. But post GDPR, certainly there was an uptake and an uptick in data subject access requests, requirements, mandatory requirements under the GDPR for things like your formal records of processing, your formal DPIAs, your impact assessment. And really people had to move in many instances, in certainly medium to large organizations, from an Excel spreadsheet to something like a platform or software solutions, particularly where they were collaborating with their colleagues, something like an impact assessment where you need input from the security team and other teams as well. There's also, I think, emerging at the sort of the next layer, and it might even, you might even call it, the next gen, where you might have had a data discovery tool that might have showed you and highlighted where the data was residing in your organization. But the next question is, well, okay, well, how do I manage it? What do I do about that? What's the next applied version of that? And this is where the next gen of tools are coming in. It's saying, okay, we know the data's there. Let's risk assess that data. Let's understand just how much personal data is in there, and let's do something about it. Let's mitigate the risk so that the business feels confident that it could use it for things like perhaps data analytics or for other areas of the business as well. So these are probably the next gen of tools that are emerging. And when you look at what might be in the GDPR to incentivize somebody to invest in these tools, I'll take an example of pseudonymization for a minute. And whilst it might not seem obvious in the beginning, that the GDPR actually incentivizes company to look at pseudonymization. When you look at the various articles where pseudonymization would be referred to, you can start to see why, in fact, you might be incentivized to pseudonymize data. So, for example, you're struggling to find a lawful basis for a secondary use of data. You land on legitimate interest, which might help you for your analytics. But legitimate interest talks about doing the balancing test. So how can you show and demonstrate that you have looked at the data subject's rights and made sure that your rights haven't overridden those? Well, one of the ways to do that is to protect their rights by pseudonymizing the data so that you're using only the right amount of personal data. So that's an example of where pseudonymization incentivizes a business to invest in it so that it has more confidence around its lawful basis. A couple of other quick examples of how, if, for example, you want to demonstrate data protection by design, as we've been listening to, or accountability. Again, pseudonymization is an area where you can show that. But also data security. If you've had a data breach and you've heavily pseudonymized the data, there is perhaps an opportunity not to have to notify or notify the data subject because you're confident about the level of identifiability in the data that has been breached, such that you think nobody could be actually identified in there. Similarly, Article 11 talks about if you pseudonymize the data such that you would say to the data subject, I actually can't identify you in this data set, then you don't have to respond to a data subject access request. So those are just a couple of little examples of why a company might say, well, actually, this does incentivize us to look at tools like pseudonymization. And actually, it's good for business because data minimization is in there as well. And we should only really be using the right amount of personal data. We shouldn't have personal data flowing through our organization in an unfettered way. And as chief privacy officers, we're not really sure where the data is, who's accessing it, etc. So some of these tools help in that layer of data governance.
So, and I think that you've certainly actually covered the waterfront there in a way that gives a very good perspective and leads into sort of asking, so this is from a larger scale compliance overview standpoint, which of course, as you reference, I like to say the landscape is changing, but the horizon is clear, right? The principles are pretty consistent. But Laura, when you're looking at pain points within an organization, is there a particular vantage point or conflicts and pain points and issues that you think that in-house counsel that we're really facing down and anything you wanted to share on that and talk to?
Well, I mean, I think the need for pragmatism and to acknowledge the fact that there's no single plug and play, and that these, I think the need for privacy tech is really about figuring out pragmatic ways to integrate in a broader governance perspective. So none of these tools, all of the tools are fabulous, but they all require a lot of customization and contextualization within your organization, and figuring out how to do that in a cost-effective way that minimizes complexity. So, to touch on sort of the spectrum of obligations that we have, one is, to support the business and to enhance the business, promote innovation, and all companies, and this is alluded to sort of throughout this panel, but we're all data companies, whether we have data products or whether we rely on data to understand the business that we're primarily in. We're all data organizations. So, figuring out how to optimize the use of data in a responsible, ethical, and compliant way means that you really have to think beyond just the, a legal obligation and beyond a compliance obligation, and figure out how to work with your security team, your technology team, your business partners, and make this intuitive and, build it in to existing processes. So to that end, I think the pain points are really how to balance money, time, and the reality, when you're talking about things like pseudonymization and the introduction of pets into business life cycle. I mean, that's not like a quarter by quarter undertaking, right? It's really sort of an organizational transformation, and all of the laws that we talked about, at the beginning of this section, we have to think beyond the corner, because there's a lack of clarity. Like what's going on in India and China, we don't really know yet, but we have to have an idea. And with Schrems, the evolving landscape in Europe after Schrems, we know a lot, but we don't know everything. And so how do you build huge technological sort of machines today, because we have to start planning today for work that will be completed in 2 years. So it's a lot of practical, sort of cost adjusted. I think
navigate. It's a lot. Well, it's a lot to navigate.
It's a lot to navigate. Yeah, just to simply say that there's no plug and play is really probably where I should have stopped with that. But
No. I think we're all astute points. I wanted to lead into that and follow through here. I want to sort of piggyback on that and say that clearly we know, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there with the notion that the tech can be the cure for the data, but the tech needs a driver. It needs a technologist. It needs a universe of people who are giving input to it to really understand the language that they're using and what access means, right? So are we processing? Yes, sorry, what processing means. Are we processing? Yes, you have access to it. There's a whole universe of work that has to be done within an organization in a lot of cases to rise up to meet the tech. So I think that that's a key part. And then Aoife, I know that you wear 2 hats, or probably more hats than that, but certainly that in your work ahead of the privacy by design, the innovation aspect of what you're doing at your company, I'm wondering, are you getting a specific kind of feedback, or in the tech industry, is there something that you're seeing more and more from both consumers who have their own pain points and organizations that you're starting to see when they're choosing and deploying tech, or what they're asking for?
Yeah, so my role within TROPT, which is a young company, we're only in existence about 3 years now. My role is Chief Privacy Officer, and I also was asked to take on the Chief of Product Innovation. And that might sound a little strange, but the reason is because of the nature of the products that we're designing. We're designing products that are trying to solve some of the pain points that organizations are having when they have data and they want to unlock value from that data, but they want to do so in a privacy compliant way, but even going beyond that, they want to act responsibly and ethically, and they want to keep the trust of their consumer. So, a lot of companies aspire to that, but it's difficult to do. So when we talk to companies, a lot of the issues that we're hearing coming from companies are the following. Certainly in a post-COVID recovery world, everybody is looking at bottom line and looking at how can they grow and continue to be competitive. How can they take data-driven decisions? They have data and they really want to be able to unlock insights from that data so that can really help them in understanding where to drive growth in the post-COVID era, where most companies have had some negative impact and are looking to reestablish growth again. So they have the data, but there's a lot of paralysis in many companies about what they're actually allowed to do with that data. You might read the GDPR, you might read the CCPA, and it doesn't become very clear to them what it is they can and cannot do. And a lot of the privacy folk sit at the center of the business, where every day they're getting requests from the business. We want to use the data for this use case. We want to use the data for that use case. And, it can be really difficult for the privacy folk to understand where to find this balance between how to help be an enabler for the business, help to drive insights from the data, but to do so in a way that's going to comply with the law and be able for them to be able to explain to their colleagues why sometimes they say yes, why sometimes they say no to particular use cases. And a lot of this is around the idea of secondary uses of data. Most businesses collect data for a particular original purpose. The data resides there. And of course, people say, well, there's really interesting data in there. Could we use it for this use case or that use case? Everything from churn propensity to customer segmentation or whatever it is. And it's up to the CPO very often, or the data stewards, to make some decisions around how to use the data. But very often they're not they don't have the tools yet to really understand at a fine-grained level within a data set, well, how much personal data is in there? And, you know, how would I mitigate some of the risks relating to that data such that I'm allowing the right amount of personal data to be shared with the right people in the organization for the right use cases? And this is where sort of the holy grail is around data analytics, because this will allow a lot more collaboration in an interdisciplinary level amongst the various cohorts who have to sit together and make these tough decisions about data use. And this is something we're working at in Troata, and this is my role, is to work with the data scientists, the product team and the engineering team, where we devise what may be tools which can be used at the intersection of analytics and privacy, and help our customers really forensically understand what's in the data, how do they mitigate it, but then how do they release data that's now been made appropriate for usage. So that's kind of how I came about, because we're looking at it from the lens of the privacy side of things, because privacy is in our DNA, but it's the data scientists who I manage along with the product, and then the engineering folk take what we're building and scale it up. So that's kind of where we sit, but I think this really goes to the heart of data, which is what we're all talking about, and how could we use data appropriately. But nevertheless, business need to get ROI out of data, but they want to do so in a way that actually then will demonstrate to their consumers that they're using it responsibly and ethically. And I think there's no question about the fact that consumers have become a lot more aware of their rights, both from the GDPR, the CPRA, and actually that's a common thread amongst all of those laws that I mentioned, which is increased data subject rights and more likelihood that data subjects will be active, both in terms of perhaps exercising their rights, but also in terms of who they choose to do business with and who they trust. And it was interesting just even the last few weeks to see what happened with WhatsApp when they went to do an updated privacy notice. And some might say it wasn't very well worded, but it gave rise to lots of their consumers leaving and going to other apps like Signal, whose usage went through the roof. And it was because they weren't sure what was being asked about them in terms of data sharing, but they chose to leave. And I thought that was interesting, because we're seeing that incrementally, is consumers are voting with their feet, which means that organizations need to be able to take seriously how do they demonstrate that they are acting responsibly and ethically with their consumer data. And just saying it isn't enough anymore. You have to show how you're doing it. And that's where privacy tech can come in, because you really need to go down to the data layers and automate at scale in order to be able to manage big data in a way that you're confident as an organization that you are actually doing the right thing.
No, and I think that that makes a lot of sense, addressing both the pain points of consumers and the companies that serve them. And certainly we know that also the feedback that I know from other tech companies and I know from the realm is more, is also lining back up with the how do we do the same sort of collaboration that you were discussing with different tools across different countries while sharing our approaches to this, right? So the ability to globalize your program and to help so that tools are accessible and understandable to the people in your organization. So I think that that's critical. I do know we want to leave a little bit for time for questions. So we wanted to round out our discussion to be certain that we're talking about where we think the next tech will be. And I know that Aoife, you had touched on that a little bit. I'll certainly weigh in with my own vantage point, which is where I'm most grounded, which is I think that social justice has to be a massive issue and a piece where privacy is coming to weigh in, whether it's simply DEI or goes a step beyond that. I also think that we are going to need a lot more technologists. And I realize that that's not a tech question, but if you're providing the tech and you don't as a community have enough privacy technologists to help integrate it, to navigate it with and for the organizations on either side, whether you're providing a different support model as a technology organization to smaller and even larger organizations that simply haven't yet allotted or allocated the resources, the human resources or otherwise, to help support what you're bringing in. so that they can best leverage it. So those are the two big components that I see on the horizon. And I'm just wondering, Laura, did you have any thoughts about sort of where we're headed from a privacy tech standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I know we talked about this before, but I think I'm a big proponent of, the cliche privacy by design to me really means, making this more about technologists and more about privacy engineering from the very beginning. So I think one of the big pain points in reality, and we haven't touched upon this because it's not very sexy to talk about, but most organizations have a lot of legacy technology. They have data that was collected and to the paralysis around what do I do with all this great data that I have, what were the rights that were associated with it when it was brought into our environment, et cetera. That there's a lot of cleanup to be done before we can actually just utilize technology to solve all the problems. So for me, the conversation around transparency and accountability and creating an intuitive and simple narrative that consumers and internal stakeholders within an organization can understand and relate to in a common sense, touchable way is really a role that technology and privacy pros can play in tandem. So to me, I feel really passionate about using technology and technologists and to get this profession, this area that we all work in, to make sense to people, so that it's not like an add-on or a burden or an afterthought, but really just something that's part of doing our keeping track of our finances and our just yeah.
So before I let Aoife sort of bring us home on this, I do want to say another unsexy thing that we don't talk about in the privacy community because it's not as hot or saleable, but we all know underpins everything we do. And I think that you actually hit on something really critical there for would-be innovators and entrepreneurs, is that this all sits atop fundamental information governance, right? Which is the thing that erodes security. It's the thing that erodes privacy. And it is the thing that some tech companies are partnering with privacy companies to look at. But there really needs to be a shift, I think, in the way that organizations, even as they start as companies, right, begin to put the framework in place for real control around information governance, which can support all of these technologies. And I know that there's that distance there because privacy has some great differentiations with regard to the law. But I think it's worth harkening back to that and saying exactly what you did, which is there's more to address here. And if we are a little more willing to look at the information governance side, I think these tech companies will go miles ahead. I'm sorry. So Aoife, if you might want to bring us home with your view of what's coming, then we.
Yeah, a couple of things, I suppose. Well, I think we're all in wild agreement around the need for this interdisciplinary approach. I often say to people that the end of privacy that I've ended up working in is the really geeky end. It's really working with the data scientists. It's really understanding the data itself. But what that has really shown me is, the privacy person cannot do it alone. They also need to start becoming quite conversant in technology and data, because it all comes back to data. But also the data scientists need to be very conversant in data is a regulated asset. Personal data is a regulated asset. You cannot do with it whatever you want. There are constraints, and they need to understand those boundaries within which they're working. And then you can also look at what's coming out of the labs in terms of the next evolution of privacy tech. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And there needs to be this, we need to be conversant around ethics as well, and what we feel is the right thing to do. And these are all difficult questions, but this is going to take a real community for us to really get in here and sort of address these issues in an interdisciplinary way, which is why this conference is so interesting. It's why this topic is so interesting, because it brings together a whole bunch of different skill sets that actually all need to be able to talk to one another and understand. And personally, I'd love to see the law schools have far more modules on computer science and on engineering. And I'd like to see the engineering and the computer science also have much more modules on privacy laws, because we all need to be able to start talking at a common denominator language about what it is we're trying to do. In terms of where privacy tech is likely to go and the sort of challenges they're going to likely look at, I was looking at a PwC report, and it was interesting. Just a couple of statistics. It said, it spoke to lots of different businesses about emerging tech like AI and blockchain, etc. And 70% of those respondents said AI is critical to at least some of their business, but only 31% said they're confident in digital trust controls for AI security, privacy, and data ethics. In the same way with IoT, 81% of businesses said it's critical to their business, but only 39% said they're comfortable. They're building sufficient digital trust controls into the adoption of IoT. Blockchain, 61% of businesses said it was important to them or some aspect of their business. 25% said they're comfortable that they're building sufficient digital controls. So we've got all of these technologies that are starting, well, I mean, they're there, but they're starting more widespread adoption. IoT, wearable sensors, AI and blockchain and others. There was other ones in there as well. But there's such a low rate of confidence around digital trust. And that has to be solved. And again, it's likely that this is where privacy tech can play a role, in that it's going to have to work at scale. And there's complexities there in terms of addressing this. But that's probably the next frontier as well.
It begs one question. We have a lot of comments. People are getting very excited, so I want to keep you speaking for a second. But it does talk to credibility, both of the tech itself within organizations and for consumers who are looking for it, and of the organizations using it. And so, very, very early on, certain markings and associations became the hallmark of things we can trust. And so then I do wonder, based on what you're saying, is there some way, is there's some, perhaps, we need to think about how we can give credibility to organizations, meaning you can be using a certain tool and that makes you more credible, but will something arise within the rise of privacy tech that actually not so much regulates, but grades or assesses privacy tech that goes beyond just reviews, right? So there might actually be something there whereby, so that the transparency and credibility filters through the organizations to the people it's actually meant to get to, be it the employees or the consumers. You can get the stamp of, we're using a such and such certified privacy tech, which is just an interesting concept that does flow, because when you say that we need everyone to be able to do this, we know that that tech will be able to do it at varying levels of integrity and provability. So it's interesting, and I just throwing that.
Yeah, and it's always a problem. Tech is ahead of regulation. It's always been, and it always will. And there's a catch up. But the problem is, there have been problems, and there's a techlash because of that. GDPR talks about codes of conduct. It talks about certifications. But, almost 3 years in, and we've seen very little movement in that space already. So it's difficult to see. But I think you're right. A big area here is confidence. How do we build confidence in that the tools will give that sort of forensic level of detail to those who need to make the choices in how they're going to mitigate risk? One of our products that we've released this year is called TROPT Calibrate. And what it does is it assesses both direct identifiers and indirect, the quasi-identifiers, the hidden identifiers within a data set. And it shines a light on where they exist in the vast columns of big data, but also it'll give a scoring. And this scoring now will allow privacy pros and others to say, that data set is too risky to share or allow externally. We have got to mitigate that risk. Let's transform it. Let's go in and do generalization or perturbation or whatever, bring down that risk score, make it safe to share. And now we've got a level of confidence that we've addressed the risk. We can now release that data both internally or externally. So that's the sort of new tech that is emerging.
No, and I think that's, and somebody did make a good point that scoring is hard because privacy is contextual, but I think that might be for the organization and not for the tech. And so to focus back in on that, we've got the NIST privacy framework, right? Yeah. But there's no sort of SOC 2 equivalent. Now, without digging into people's IP or tech's IP, the notion that maybe we can have an audit, right? That there could exist in the future, an audit around privacy tech to make sure that it meets the privacy consideration equivalent of a SOC 2 that isn't about security, but is about making sure that you have the ability to do all the things we need to do: deletion, anonymization, pseudonymization, all of these things, de-identification, and of course finding things. So it's just interesting.
And that's where privacy tech is probably still nascent. You look at the security industry and you see 10 years ago where they were and where they are now, and more ISOs, etc. So yeah, you're right. It'll be interesting. And I suppose that also will catalyze the growth in privacy tech, because those consumers, people like Laura, who every day or is regularly looking at vendors who are selling them tools, it's for people like Laura to be able to assess them and really understand before they invest in software into their enterprises, what are they going to get, how will it work?
Yeah, and to that point, barring the emergence of third-party certifications and other kind of objective metrics that we can use, I think the whole point of context and using forensic accountability internally to explain where you are, because maybe no one will ask you, but you need to have a framework internally and a set of principles that you're constantly evaluating. And whether it's, now we're being asked to, even assess the transfers that we're making, under SCCs, et cetera. So there is this need internally for us to be conversant and to have, I think, metric-driven evaluations within the company, even before there's something to tie it to, which I hope is sooner than 10 years. But
and I think that objectivity at least gives someone, Laura, like you, the ability to explain transparently why yes and why no to certain use cases. Look, the risk is just too high on this one because we need to mitigate some of these privacy risks in this data set. And I think we've been missing sort of the ability to coalesce around objectivity or mathematical scorings. Up to now, it can often be seen as very subjective, or the CPO is just stopping us doing stuff we want to do, and why can't we do it? And that's often a tug of war in a business, where the business needs, the marketing needs, and others, and can often drive the agenda, because that's where they see the needs. But I think if the privacy folk, the data stewards and others have more objective tools which can demonstrate this is why this is a risky data set. Here is the amount of quasi-identifiers we have here, but we're going to mitigate those and we'll make it suitable for you. So we will allow access. And here's the type of data set that you will then have.
Well, I think I have to say, I think one of the big takeaways has to be for everyone what a savvy and wise move it was at TROPT to make sure that privacy by design is not just integrated in a perfunctory way, but that you're actually sitting atop of innovation. And regardless what companies are doing, I think having your privacy officer or your privacy department integrated in that process, not simply through a box check and a DPIA, but actually part of the process and part of the oversight there, I think that is an incredibly savvy move that a lot of organizations, and certainly any kind of privacy tech organization or things that touch information governance should be looking to. So I think that if nothing else, that's what I would take away.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think we did have some questions earlier on. I don't know where we are on time. We have a couple minutes. So someone said, one person had said, we forgot how to classify data because data storage got so cheap, which I certainly second, right? People just throw everything into the closet. And yes, that's why the less sexy piece of information governance is another aspect of where this tech might need to line itself up to make sure that you're not simply pinpointing one aspect of the problem, but helping the companies solve how they got there. Did you see another question?
And actually, Shoshana, I think that's where privacy can also help. I mean, if you actually do have a data minimization policy where you're saying, look, it's about good data, it's about clean data, it's about accurate data. We don't need more data, or we don't need to retain it. Let's try and, create a smaller data set let's make sure the data that's there is the data that has value. It will drive insights for us, but let's minimize also the amount of personal data that we need for things like insights, because people seem to be obsessed with personal data when in fact you can derive a lot of really valuable insights and trends and longitudinal studies based on non-personal data or pseudonymized data, or just data that's been minimized, because you don't need all that data. So it's good from a governance point of view, it's good from a liability point of view, makes CPOs sleep better at night. So, you know, we need to do some of these things as well as just allowing the business just to keep collecting data for the sake of it. I think we should be beyond that.
Well,
now.
and that's the thing that the tech can't really touch, right? Is the awareness, the constant awareness of the information that's passing through the data owners within an organization, that their interaction and the level of savvy there is the part that the tech can't necessarily compensate for. That if they're properly classifying, handling, and getting rid of in the data lifecycle the information that they handle, if that regimen, right, there's this whole thing of creativity can live where there's structure, and if there's a little more structure and those pain points are met around change management there, everything else will start to fall out more easily, because you can't talk about privacy until you teach people how personal information differs from all the other kinds of information. So I completely agree. I think it's a heck of a problem.
Yeah, I third that on the data, the end-to-end data governance visibility. We have to imagine data as a life cycle in our organizations and really be able to understand where it lives, and, you know, have systems overlays and, you know, protection overlays, right? Because it's not all the same all the time, and to be able to figure out where we need to be most restrictive with access controls and, you know, most aggressive with, you know, retention and deletion and so on. I think the more that we take out of that sphere of highly restrained, the better that we foster, you know, sort of creativity and innovation, which is really the purpose of our roles, and speaks a lot to that cross-functional collaboration that really underlies, I think, this space.
Agreed. Well, if we don't have questions, I'm not going to take us out. Does anybody have any questions? We still have a minute with Lauren. We did have someone chime in and say, rightly so, that a lot of data that is collected is noise, and then you have to have backup principles. And really, organizations getting their hands around what is where is something that privacy is actually forcing, in a way that it's not just the tech leading the way. The laws have led the way, the tech has pushed ahead, and now the information governance has to catch up again. So thank you, everyone.
I think less is more is what we can also say, Shoshana, on that one.
And less cost
when it comes to all that. When breaches happen, suddenly people are scratching their heads and going, how come that data was still there? I thought we were supposed to have got rid of that data. And suddenly, you know, they realize that data that shouldn't have been retained was retained. And so much of it just comes down to data management, really.
So maybe we can teach people about not just their privacy rights, but also the importance of different kinds of information. Even, you know, maybe we teach that in schools. We teach that in grade school and start lining everyone up to do a good job of this. No, very, very grateful for your time today, and a pleasure to join you both.
Thanks all.
Lovely to meet you. Bye for now.